Hi.
Hello.
Hi.
Hey guys, welcome back to SLT time. This is episode 2. So last week we spoke about Black Lives Matter, and we were joined by Angela and Hiro from the SLTs of Color platform. This week we're going to talk more about the history of the ethnic diversity within SLT as a profession. We've done some research, we've got some stats, and so we can sort of really discuss the root of the problem and where to go from there, and also our personal experiences about coming into speech therapy as a profession. I'm Ilya, and we're joined by
Iva. Hi.
Hey, I'm Miriam.
Hi, I'm Taha.
Hi, I'm Veronica, and I graduated 8 years ago now, and at the moment I run online speech and language courses for parents.
Before we start this episode, we just want to say thank you to all the people that engaged with us about last week's episode. We really enjoyed listening to all the feedback and all the positive comments, and also the constructive criticism that we received as well. It was really interesting, and we hope that we get the same level of engagement for this episode.
So to begin with, we just wanted to roughly go through the history of speech and language therapy as a profession. So some of the information that I'm going to talk about next was on the RCSLT website. SLT can be traced back to the 19th century, and speech and language therapists started practicing at the beginning of the 20th century, and they were largely self-taught at this time. Speech and language therapists came from two groups. So the first were those interested in eloquence of public speaking, and the second lot of those were those that worked as elocutionists. Many of the teachers came from a theatrical background, and in 1925, the Central School of Speech Training and Dramatic Art established a separate department for speech therapy. Hospital-based schools of speech therapy were then established in 1926 and 1932, and then in 1945, a 3-year qualification was established UK-wide. So initially, SLTs originally worked in private practice, and then in the 20th century, they began to be employed by schools and hospitals and started. So the Royal College initially started as the College of Speech and Language Therapists, and it was established in 1945. And then in 1995, it was awarded the royal title and became RCSLT as we know it now. So the core of speech therapy in general changed significantly between, the early 20th century, the first few speech and language therapists and the kind of work that they were doing, to what we are doing now day to day. So early client groups were initially people that stammer, people that had aphasia, children with cleft lip and palate. Speech and language therapists now work within a range of clinical areas. So I always, going back to diversity within speech and language therapy, I always wondered whether the history of how speech and language therapy evolved is a factor in terms of the low diversity that we have currently. I also wonder if there's still a misunderstanding in terms of the areas that we work in, and whether there's still that perception that we fix people's speech, or we work just with speech sounds, and essentially teach people how to speak properly. So I was just wondering what you guys thought of that, if you think that the history of...
I definitely agree. I mean, I had someone contact me about a month ago and ask if I could train their daughters to be better public speakers. So I think there is still a big misconception about what speech and language therapists actually do. Even, not just all about those things that we do deal with, like speech sounds. I mean, there's still that, misconception that we deal with elocution and public speaking as well.
I think that when Miriam was reading out the stats and what you said just now, Veronica, it reminded me of the fact that every time I bring up that I'm doing speech language therapy or I'm going to be a speech language therapist, like literally 70% of the time, King's Speech is mentioned because of the, like, I think it was a popular film when it came out, but that is the very little exposure that we've had in terms of a wider scale. We're not really seen on TVs or films and stuff. So I think that is still linked to us. We're still teaching people how to talk properly, whether that's stammering or changing accents. So yeah, I think that's definitely alive now.
I think what you mentioned in that history just there is really important as well, because like you said, I think it was such a niche and a private sort of specialist thing to have. And obviously the communities that had access to that kind of specialist service were very upper class, white communities who could afford it. And historically, most of the communities that I imagine we all come from would not have been exposed to that unless they were given specific referrals from school or from hospitals, or have had a family member that have experienced something like a head injury or cleft lip. And I know that I never had heard of speech therapy growing up. My first exposure to it was purely because I studied linguistics at an undergraduate level. And for me, it was kind of just, linguistics, career, speech therapy made sense. But in terms of, had I actually ever been exposed to a speech therapist in my community or in the schools that I went to growing up in sort of inner city London, I had never had a conversation with one. So I definitely think, particularly in our ethnic minority communities, the perception of a speech therapist is really skewed because there's, like you said, Tabor, there's not been exposure to it. Right. And most people we talk to have seen King's Speech as well, and they get really shocked that we're doing something like that.
I was just going to say, when I think back to my kind of school days and when I was younger, I would never have met a speech and language therapist. So I think, like you said, a lot of our exposure to the profession came from either knowing someone maybe who had speech and language therapy, or kind of stumbling into the career. So I think the actual exposure and the awareness around what we actually do is really lacking. And that's probably relevant for other allied health professionals as well, because I think there's still quite a lot of confusion about what we actually do.
Yeah, and I think what's sort of sadly ironic is that a lot of the communities that we're talking about now would actually really benefit from the service that we're providing. Like, during my studies, I worked as a library assistant in all the Coventry libraries, which is where I'm from, and I met so many children, and I sort of saw potentially how useful it might be, whether I'm talking to a child, who's looking for a book, who has an ASD diagnosis, or just children that are like obviously would be supported by a speech language therapist, but they don't know because either their school doesn't have that service linked to their school, or they don't know what it is. Their parents don't know that a profession like that actually exists.
Yeah. Do you think that comes back to the places that these families are from? Like, for example, a good friend of mine is from Somalia, and her son has got autism. Now, when her son was first diagnosed, she'd never heard of a speech and language therapist. Back home, I'm not sure whether they have speech and language therapists, whether it's that common as a profession in other countries. So do you think a lot of the, how people are not aware is because back home, maybe there isn't this kind of profession?
Maybe, but then I think, like, my parents came in 1980, well, my mum came in 1986 and my dad came in 1992, and they only ever heard of speech language therapy when I brought it up to them and said, Mum and Dad, I'm not going to do medicine, I'm going to do this instead. Before that, they hadn't heard. So, I mean, they had been in this country for quite a long time before they had ever heard of it. So maybe it is the fact that it's not so, the profession so much isn't so prevalent in other countries, but I think there is just a general lack of conversation around the other allied health professionals that exist beyond like physiotherapy and occupational therapy, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think there are speech and language therapists in other countries, but I think it's the same issue as we have here, in that only people that use the service are aware of it. So they're only aware of it once the need arises, I guess.
We also take for granted a little bit that we've got an NHS system here, and these kind of services are very, very specialised and very niche abroad. Certainly, countries I visited, I know that speech therapy is available, but you'd be paying a lot of money for it, and schools don't have connections with those sort of external private organisations. So the fact that you're able to be referred within the NHS system here and people still don't know what's available to them, I think is like really shocking.
Do you think as well, just going back to how speech and language therapists initially started practicing, the 3-year course started in 1945 a 3-year qualification was established, but it's probably, I'm not sure what the dates are that uni started having speech and language therapy courses. So I've had quite a few people ask me, how do you become a speech and language therapist, not knowing that it's a degree. And then when I would say, oh, you go to uni, you study for 3 years, or you do a master's, then they're like, oh, okay, I don't want to do it anymore, because they think it's basically just playing with kids, or these are children that have been exposed to speech and language therapy in a PEDS environment. They're not aware that qualified speech and language therapists do have to go to uni and do have to study. So I wonder if that sort of impacts it as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think what you said about the fact that it started in 1945 as a 3-year course, it's a huge commitment for communities that are potentially just coming over to England to build up the 1945, build up the economy after that. I'm saying like 1947, 48 for the country after World War II.
Something that Taba mentioned in her introduction in one of the first videos that we did, about how your parents kind of expected you to go down a doctor route. So imagine, like, our parents have all come to this country. If you're going to go to university for any reason, it has to end up with something that is of value in our parents' eyes, right?
Yeah, it's a huge investment.
Exactly. And so it's so expensive, and it's so financially draining on our communities. And so when people don't really understand what it is that a speech therapy does, why would they invest in that? I know in my community, everyone is like, why are you wasting your time studying something that's like really quite low level? But actually, we're very necessary in our services, and we're very well respected. And when you're in it and you're in the healthcare system, you get it. But outside of that, you don't.
You don't, absolutely. And I think when I first brought it up to my parents, because I am like, I think I'd be classed as a second generation immigrant. My parents came here, they weren't born, and then I was born here. So for them, and for me as well, and other communities and other young people my age, is that getting a job is you climbing through the economic ranks. Your parents need to know that you are going to be well off, better than they ever were. And so for them, it's medicine, dentistry, things that have a substantial respect in the society, as well as a financial stability. So when I first brought it up to them, they were like, that's like studying fine art. What are you talking about? Do you know what I mean? Like I was like, what do you mean? There's nothing wrong with that. But then now, when she's talking on the phone with like relatives, my mum, and I have a distant cousin who has had an ASD diagnosis and is getting, speech and language therapy. Now she's like full of pride and really acknowledging the value of it. But as an immigrant mother who was worried about her daughter's financial stability, it's scary, and I guess that's the same as it was back then as it is now.
Yeah,
it's quite interesting actually, you talking about how your parents maybe didn't think it was a good career path, but my parents actually thought it was a really good career path. And they actually kind of pushed me into it, I would say, because I wanted to do more kind of linguistics and languages, and they were like, but what are you going to do after that? If you do speech and language therapy, that's like a proper job, that's a vocation. So my parents were actually quite keen on me doing it, rather than something that's seen as, what are you going to do after it kind of thing. And I think my parents were quite aware of it, because 2 of my brothers actually had speech and language therapy when I was growing up. So they were quite aware of the profession, because obviously we'd had experience of it.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask actually. Like, I was curious, how were your parents exposed to it, to have a positive outlook on it, to encourage their child to go on it, which is really nice to hear actually.
Yeah, but my parents, they come from like low socioeconomic backgrounds and things, because my grandparents actually moved here from Poland after the Second World War, and I think that has had a big impact on them really pushing us to do well, because I remember my mum talking about how like her dad had like so many jobs, and like he was a coal miner, and then he was this and that, and how they really like worked really, really hard to get to where they were. And I've always got that kind of work ethic, I think, from my parents as well, because they're always like, oh, you need to do this, you need to do well, you need to get good grades, you need to get a good job kind of thing. So yeah, I think across lots of different communities, there is this kind of push, to really excel and like go above, get better, don't be low socioeconomic status, work your way up.
I completely agree with what you just said. And my parents were really happy when they heard about what career I was going to go into, because I think they knew that it was going to be a good combination of medical and linguistics, and they kind of understood the profession more. But I think, like, from all our personal experiences, it goes to show kind of cultural influences in your career choice, right? Because it has a huge impact. And I think maybe not a lot of people understand those, you know, your family, your expectations, especially from your parents, whatever career they've been into. If they've been doctors themselves, there might be a push for the medical side of, medical careers. So I think it goes to show it makes a huge difference. And the kind of future students in speech and language therapy from, diverse backgrounds, from minority backgrounds, are going to have maybe that fighting against them.
It's interesting what you're saying about our cultural influences, because me personally, and I imagine actually all of us, were heavily introduced into the speech therapy world through linguistics and languages and our exposure of that growing up, right? And I mean, for me, it was just logical to go into speech therapy because I had grown up surrounded by 3-4 different languages in the home, and I wanted to explore that deeper, what that meant, what was the science behind it. And so that's how I did my research into speech therapy. And it's interesting for us as ethnic minorities, diaspora in this country, who have had such exposure and who have such a rich linguistic upbringing, how we can encourage younger generation to also make that link and be brought into that.
I think you've all said exactly what I've been thinking. I mean, in terms of our parents, and like you described your parents, Tayyiba and Veronica, and I'm sure all of our parents, they've sacrificed so much coming to this country. And I think what's important to remember, even with the parents that we see in clinic, whether we're working with adults or children, a parent might come to us, or a service user might come to us, and they can't speak English properly, or as we would think, proper English is spoken. But actually, these people they were doctors, they were lawyers in their home countries, they went to uni, they had jobs. It's just that they don't have that now because that qualification isn't valid in the UK. So that does impact us as children, I guess. And we want to make sure that all of their hard work has come to something. Like, we can show them, you sacrificed so much when you were younger, and I went to uni and I have a stable job now, and you don't have to worry anymore. And I think that's the key thing there. And I think once the parents understand what speech and language therapy is and the prospects of it, I think that they would support their children in pursuing that as a career. But it's just getting that information out there in order to get more diverse students.
I love that point about understanding where there's people, that the families we work with, that they were really respected and had all these jobs back home, and they've been forced to move to this country, and then we treat them like, you don't deserve our services because you don't speak English, or you can't access them, or having a bias that they're not going to engage with therapy because they're from this culture. And I mean, I've seen it, I've witnessed literally like in notes and in the office of people being like, they're Arab, and Arabs genuinely don't like to keep up with therapy plans, or like their DNA, they didn't turn up to the session, and that's typical because they're Asian. Like, I've seen it happen so many times, and it's just really upsetting when people don't value the families and kind of the struggles that they've been through, which we all understand, I think, being speech therapists.
And the barriers,
get other people to understand that too.
Exactly. The barriers to accessing our services are, I think, as therapists, we need to understand what that is, especially for a parent, like you said, Miriam, who maybe their English is not that good, and what is it going to be like for them especially if they've just, they've just come to the country, their first ever consultation is with you. There's so many maybe barriers that they might experience as well.
Yeah, and I think just having that understanding of all the baggage that they have as well, like emotional baggage that they have with them. If someone has recently come to the country and they've lost everything, like, can you imagine, you have a career, you have a stable job, you have a stable wage, and then all of a sudden you have to start from zero. And I think sometimes we speak about, in speech therapy, is speech therapy priority right now? So thinking about what's stopping them from engaging, or which other way can I present this information for them to be able to digest it better.
Is speech therapy a priority right now? Maybe not, but how can we work as an MDT and support any other healthcare intervention that's happening with that family, with that patient? As a speech therapist, how can we support the physio session that is more of a priority, or the psychology session that's happening that's more of a priority? Where can we work in an interdisciplinary way that make sure that we are utilizing our skills as communicators in making sure that, you know, all healthcare services are accessible?
I guess that's where the balance system model comes in, doesn't it? Because, you know, when you think about that universal approach, you know, we are supposed to be working with everyone really in trying to make everyone better communicators in order to help service users.
I think very simple things like, you know, parent training, or that we give, for example, all of them are in English, and a lot of parents can't access it, and there's so many technical terms in there. A parent might be able to get by with day-to-day level of English, but this, you know, when you're teaching a parent about blanks levels or vocab learning, there's so many technical terms within that they'll probably get lost. And
absolutely,
you know,
I mean, I'm always a big advocate of, you know, translating information into as many languages as possible, because, you know, there are so many parents out there who cannot understand English well enough to be able to understand the information that is presented to them. And I think you know, we don't do it enough. It definitely needs to happen a lot more. And I think it's about making everyone aware, all health professionals, that, you know, there are a lot of people out there who need the information in a different way. And what can they do to make it more accessible to all of their service users?
Yeah. And I think what I just want to say is that these experiences that we're saying, that we're, you know, translation and access to English, these all come from a level of lived and personal experiences from us. So like for me, even to this day, I'm still translating hospital documents that come from my parents, or being an advocate, like an English advocate for my parents in doctor's appointments. And there are so many young kids who are doing it. You know, we see they come with their parents to sessions, older siblings, and it's these perspectives that I wish were heard more and sort of valued more in our profession, because these points would not come to your mind if you've never seen it or you've never thought about it, you know, which is the sad reality of the homogenous culture that we live in speech and language therapy, because everyone kind of looks the same and has come from a similar background. Nobody's really thinking about these things apart from us, and we're so fragmented, we're so separated from each other, that we're not being able to come together and actually say, you know, like Mariam's point, you need to think about the advice that you're giving and the way that you're giving it, and are the families actually being able to access it? If they're not accessing it, if they're not understanding, then of course they're not going to, you know, turn up to appointments.
So just talking about diversity within speech and language therapy, I went on the NHS website and the Gov website to try and find some statistics on diversity in the NHS overall. And this was quite interesting. So of the NHS staff whose ethnicity was known, 79.2% were white and 20.7% were from other ethnic groups. But there's a massive difference between the medical workforce and the non-medical workforce. So among the non-medical workforce, staff from Asian, Black, mixed and other groups made up a smaller number of those at senior grades, and a higher percentage of junior doctors were from Black, Chinese, mixed or other groups. What was also interesting was in terms of the medical role, 55.6% were white and 29.7% were Asian, which was the second largest, and then the rest were other. And then within the non-medical, white was 81.6%, which was massive. Yeah, so I tried to compare that data with speech and language therapy data. So unfortunately, we don't have information on qualified therapists, but we do have information on students. So by ethnicity, 76% were white, 3% Black, 7% Asian, 1% mixed, and 10% other. But what I found interesting was this table here. Okay, so this was SLT admissions from 2014 to 2019. So if we look at so white students, 645 in 2014 and 750 in 2019. But what I found interesting was this is the number of students in the whole of the UK, and there was 15 Black students in 2014 and 25 in 2018, so 10 more students only in the whole of the UK, which just blew my mind.
There was a tweet by a lady that said she'd been working 60 years as a speech and language therapist and had only met one other Black SLT, and that blew my mind.
Yeah.
And of course, only 15, 10 extra that from 2014 to 15 is mad.
Yeah,
Right.
and I mean, we don't have numbers in terms of how many graduated, so the amount of graduated therapists is likely to be quite low. We know that students from ethnic minorities perform less in uni and than their white counterparts.
Mm-hmm.
So that was interesting.
That's very interesting.
What was also interesting was data on people that have medical roles that were Black was 4.6%. And I just don't understand why, like, the representation is so low. It's just crazy.
I think when you see it in the
Point is
form of
why.
numbers,
Yeah.
it's just, you cannot just ignore it.
Yeah, and I just don't understand why there is such a low number of ethnic minorities. And like we spoke about, we have this built-in motivation to achieve and, you know, to do well in school and to go to uni. And I know so many people that are amazing and can definitely be a speech therapist and can definitely be within medical roles. So there's obviously something that is stopping them on the way there.
But do you think it is because of that, you know, thing that, you know, our parents are pushing us more towards, you know, being a doctor rather than being speech and language therapist?
So there aren't that many doctors. So they face just as a lot of barriers as well to get into study medicine. And, you know, I know of people that have to leave the country and go and study somewhere else in Europe and then come and practice here. I mean, it will be interesting. I think this is all linked in our education system. I don't think you can sort of separate the two. And if you think about the amount of exclusions that in terms of ethnicity and so on, and teacher expectations and unconscious bias, and they're all so interlinked that it's hard to separate. But it doesn't take away from the fact that there are so little speech and language therapy students, and I just can't think of an excuse. I just think that we need to be doing more.
I was going to say as well, I completely agree, like more needs to be done. And I was thinking about this the other day. I was thinking it's really challenging just to get a place onto the course. And then, so especially the postgrad courses, because it's a smaller cohort, whatever other reasons there are. And then to add on to that, so statistically kind of BAME students might have a tough time financially too. So there's lots of implications there. And is that to do with so in speech and language therapy courses there's a lot of placements, there's a lot of travel? Is that also a reason why they're maybe discouraged to enter the course? I feel like there's so many levels to this. It's so complex, isn't it?
But I think for me anyway, that was one of the reasons. Like I was looking at different universities when I was applying, and I was looking at University of Manchester, and then they showed the areas that they would cover, and they said potentially you might have to travel to Cumbria, and I was like, I don't know if I'm going to be able to financially manage traveling and this, and then to hear that not sure about NHS, you know, doesn't cover as much as it used to, and then I'm thinking I can't ask money from my parents. So it was a big worry. It was sort of like, I want to do this, but is it gonna, bite me in the ass before it's going to give me any payoff. So yeah, definitely. I think there's so many factors that students from Black and ethnic minorities have to consider that I don't think, you know, majority of other people have to consider.
I think we made this point before, but I think we just need data on qualified therapists. And I think it'll be really important to have data as well in terms of banding, because we've heard from so many accounts that it's so hard for speech and language therapists from ethnic minorities to progress into the higher banding. So I think it's really important to have that, because we can only fix something if we know what we're up against, essentially.
And I also think that another way to sort of push the image of speech and language therapy out in our community is actively community outreaching, which I think we don't do well as a profession. You often see physios representing at career fairs and those type of things, but you never see a speech therapist, especially not a speech therapist of colour, at any of these type of events which are targeted at students or college level, high school level children. So I think that's another step that the Royal College and all speech therapists need to be actively investing time and money into. Suleika mentioned it last week's episode about she's been actively making sure that if there is a careers fair happening at the school that she works in, she's there, and she's there to talk to people, and she's there to talk to families, and she said that she's seen really positive outcomes of it. People stay in contact with her and say, oh, I've got somebody who's got this kind of problem, can you help me, because you mentioned something, that you do things like that. And these kind of positive interactions that we have with families in our communities are what will increase the knowledge of what we do and the image, and so it will encourage parents to encourage their children to consider it as a potential profession. So yeah, community outreach for me is a really, really big thing that needs to happen on an individual level, but from the Royal College as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think it'll be good for trusts and Royal College to take responsibility for that more than individual therapists. I think it's quite hard as an individual therapist to fit all this in, because we're so passionate about making our profession more diverse.
Really difficult, actually, even for people who are considering it as a career, to find people unless they are on social media. You can't just go to like your local NHS website and immediately find someone like you. Do you know what I mean? Obviously it depends on the area, but in the area that I live in the southwest, there's just no one.
Yeah, but then whose responsibility is it to make sure that we've got an accessible network within our profession? I think it's the Royal Colleges.
Yeah. I think we don't want tokenism. We don't want pictures to be out there that don't actually reflect the profession. But actually, I think Anne said it in the first episode, just having like a picture of a Black therapist or a therapist who wears a hijab or whatever it is, someone who looks like you. So if a young person is going to that page, so the Royal College page, and they're thinking about, okay, what career do I want to get into? Just seeing that and knowing it exists and someone who looks like you, it's comforting, I think. And it's, like you said, it's not really our responsibility to go around and talk about this all the time. It does come down to the Royal College. It comes down to the NHS Trust, the universities, but being quite tactful about it, because we don't want just it to look really, really unrealistic as well.
Yeah. But, I think it's also quite interesting to have some stats on, not just, how many people are working as speech and language therapists, but how many people have graduated and then do not enter the profession. That would be really, really interesting as well, because from my own experience, there were 3 Muslims on my course and none of us got jobs as SLTs after we graduated. And I know that from my, other 2 friends, they were trying really, really hard, but they just couldn't manage it. And I think one's gone into teaching English as a foreign language now. The other one did some SLT assistant work, but, they really struggled getting SLT positions. I mean, so how difficult is it then for graduates to get a position once they graduate?
That is really interesting, because the teaching that I received at uni, it was almost like they kind of were suggesting that, like, oh, being bilingual is a superpower. You know, it's, they kind of, everything was through a bilingualism perspective. So they were like, you know, if you're from this background, you are so valuable. You're gonna get all the jobs, and that kind of fed into the idea that, like, oh, if she gets a job, it's only because she's brown, or it's only because they need to fill a like a box. And I felt that was what kind of was a sentiment when I got my first job offer, because then I was like, are they going to think that it's just because I'm brown and that they would be able to diversify their staff room? But that's not the reality, is it? There are so many people who don't fit the box that we've created in speech and language therapy that aren't being able to sort of get their foot into their first job. And that I agree. I think we need to find more out about that.
So last week, Suleika mentioned about people having a bias towards speech therapists, but also the families we work in. And I think, like I mentioned earlier, a really important part of changing the perspective of speech and language therapists within our communities is, like I said, positive interactions with them. And I think non-Black and non-ethnic minority speech and language therapists need to actively be accommodating and ensuring that they're giving the best level of care to their ethnic minority service users, because those are already coming from backgrounds where we're distrustful of services, we're distrustful of the system, because really it's not benefited any of us. So I think having that education as a white speech therapist, but also that awareness that there are loads of other factors that you have to consider when you're interacting with this family. And the reason I really want us to encourage that in our white colleagues is because those interactions are so vital in shaping what those families are going to feel about healthcare, feel about speech and language therapists, feel about sort of systemic interactions. And that's the only way that we're going to be able to sort of break this barrier. Well, one of many barriers that I think you're able to do straight away is just change the way that you have a bias and change the way that you engage with these families, and don't write them off because you've made an assumption about the culture and how that impacts their engagement with the therapy.
Yeah, exactly. And if you're not sure about a culture, then just ask, or do the research, or whatever it is you need to do to be a competent clinician. Because at the end of the day, I think if you're not doing that work, you're kind of letting that family down a bit, and you're again, like you said, the bias is going to affect your therapy, your assessment, everything. And if that family don't engage with the service, I think it as much reflects on the therapist too. And
yeah, I mean, cultural competency is just hugely important, because if you don't have an understanding about what their cultural beliefs are around speech and language and interacting with their child, how are you going to get them to engage with interventions? If you're telling a parent, they've got to get on the floor and play with their kids, and they're like, they've never seen another adult do that before, how are you going to engage them?
Yeah. I think that's definitely true. I think it's examining what we mean by engaging, and it means different things to different people. For example, sometimes with blocks of therapy, a child might come with an older sibling to therapy. So to me, that's really normal for me to be told to take, my younger sibling to therapy would be absolutely normal for me. But for other therapists, it's like very unusual. Like, oh, this child is not responsible for the younger sibling. How is their parents sending them instead of coming themselves? And obviously I'm talking about a child that's in over 18 or that can do so and can take care of the child. But just little things like that can be seen as disengagement from parents, but it's because parents have other things that they need to be doing. What is their priority? My dad's priority might have been to go to work to make sure that he can put food on the table, so he can't balance both together. So what's the best option? You take your sister to therapy. I mean, that's just
Yeah.
a hypothetical situation.
It might be a language issue as well, though. Maybe the older sibling speaks better English. They'll be able to understand the therapist. They'll be able to understand what interventions, and then they can feed back to the parent as well.
Yeah. I think also the point earlier that you made, that like you need to take the time out to understand the family's culture and all their sort of values and stuff. It's so hard because you have to expect services to toe the line between blanketing everyone under a certain community with, like, I've seen like documents in the staff rooms that say Arab communities or Asian communities, Muslim communities, and then bullet points and sort of vague points, and maybe largely they may be correct, but even within, like, we're not a homogenous community. Like, Muslims aren't all the same. Me being a Bengali Muslim might be completely different to like a Libyan Muslim. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. But it's teaching people that cultures have certain ideals and have certain values and expectations, but each family is also very different. So you can't replace one implicit bias with another. It's so difficult.
Yeah, I think it's just the benefit of the doubt, really. Yeah. Because parents are not going to open up to you about all of their worries, because that's just not what they would do in a session. But I think it's just taking the positives of the situation and seeing what we can do. I found a few studies in terms of diversity on allied health professionals as a whole. So ethnic diversity, or the issue of ethnic diversity, is an issue within physiotherapy, occupational therapy, within midwifery, which I found quite surprising. But I guess, again, that's thinking about where do those ethnic people sit within the bandings, and the type of people that we usually see when we go into hospitals and when we're receiving a service is normally the band 5s and the band 6. But some of the research was really interesting. So there was a paper on physiotherapists, and it was called Isn't It All White? Ethnic Diversity and the Physiotherapy Profession. So the point that jumped out to me was the paper found that the paper identified a lack of ethnic diversity within the profession, and it argued that a lack of ethnic diversity may result in a failure to meet patients' needs, and a workforce that is reflective of the population it serves can have a greater cultural knowledge and is more likely to understand and respond to patients' needs. And I think that just summarizes pretty much our whole conversation today. So that was interesting. And then for in terms of occupational therapy, there was a paper on culture and diversity among occupational therapists, and this was in Ireland. And they found that occupational therapists reported challenges with colleagues and managers which revolved primarily around cultural differences in the norms and expectations guiding social interactions, communication and practice styles. So again, I thought this was quite interesting, because in one of the SLT ethnic diversity working group that I was part of, one of the points was in terms of placement, for example, that we'll hopefully speak about in future episodes, was how people perceive professionalism and how it might change from one culture to another and between people. I couldn't find much on speech and language therapy in terms of research within in the topic of ethnic diversity. So if anyone finds anything, please let us know. And I think this will be a great area of research for future academics.
Okay, great. That's it for episode 2. Thanks for listening. Be sure to follow our Twitter and our Instagram,
SLT Time,
at SLT Time.
SLT Time, to keep up to date with new episode releases.
And that's the SLT for today.
Bye.